I want you to start by just picturing someone in your head. Picture the typical, self-made billionaire.
Right, everyone has that image.
Yeah, you know the image. Or maybe picture a legendary rock star or a world-altering tech genius. You have that image locked in. Good. Hold on to it because today we are going to completely dismantle that image
We really are.
using a massive stack of research, data, and historical records. Because, the narrative we always tell about that person is always exactly the same, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's always a story of incredible solitary grit.
Exactly. It's this story of innate, one-in-a-million talent and this, relentless burning drive to succeed against all possible odds.
The whole pulling yourself up by your bootstraps thing.
Right. We love to say that. We like to believe they conquered the world purely because of who they are on the inside. But what if I told you that story is fundamentally false?
Which is a tough pill to swallow.
It is. What if the self-made individual is actually the biggest myth we have ever been sold?
It is a deeply uncomfortable thought for a lot of people. And, understandably so. We love our heroes to be lone wolves.
We really do.
We are culturally conditioned to love that narrative of rising from absolute nothingness through sheer force of will.
Yeah.
But when you actually strip away the mythology,
The PR spin, basically.
exactly, the PR spin,
Yeah.
when you look past that and examine the raw, underlying data of success, the lone hero just vanishes.
They completely disappear.
You are left looking at something much more complex, much more structural, and honestly, vastly more fascinating.
And that is exactly our mission today. Welcome to this deep dive into Malcolm Gladwell's landmark work, Outliers. We're looking at the story of success.
It's such a brilliant book.
It really is. We have a comprehensive stack of source material from this incredible text, and we are, frankly, taking a sledgehammer to the myth of the self-made individual.
A very data-driven sledgehammer.
Yes. We are going to reveal the invisible web of advantages, the shockingly lucky timing, and the deep subconscious cultural legacies that actually manufacture high achievers.
But to really understand how radical this shift in perspective is, we have to start by looking at how we misdiagnose success.
Right.
And to do that, we actually need to look at how we used to misdiagnose physical health.
Oh, this is one of my favorite parts.
Yeah, to completely shift our paradigm, a perfect starting point is a small town in Pennsylvania called Roseto.
So let me set the scene for you listening. Picture this. It is the late 1950s. A physician named Stuart Wolfe is invited to give a talk at a local medical society near this town of Roseto.
Just a standard professional visit.
Exactly. And after the talk, he's having a beer with a local doctor, and this local doctor casually mentions something that, medically speaking, should be absolutely impossible.
Right.
He says to Wolfe, I've been practicing for 17 years, and I rarely find anyone from Roseto under the age of 65 with heart disease.
Which, we really need to contextualize. That was a staggering statement for that era.
Because it was the 1950s.
Right, this is long before the invention of cholesterol-lowering drugs like statins. Heart attacks were an absolute epidemic in the United States back then.
Leading cause of death, right?
It was the leading cause of death in men under 65. So for an entire town to just not have heart disease, it completely defied medical logic.
It makes no sense.
It would be like a doctor today casually mentioning a town where no one ever gets a common cold.
Right. So Wolfe investigates. He doesn't just take the guy's word for it. He brings in researchers from the University of Oklahoma.
They did a full workup.
They did. They look at death certificates, they analyze medical records, they take blood, they do EKGs on the entire population, and they find out it is entirely true.
Which is wild.
It is. Virtually no one under 55 had died of a heart attack or even showed signs of heart disease. The death rate for men over 65 was half the national average.
And it wasn't just heart disease either.
No. There was virtually no suicide, no alcoholism, no drug addiction, and very little crime.
They didn't even have peptic ulcers.
So the researchers basically threw their hands up and concluded, well, these people are just dying of old age. That's it.
And what is fascinating here is the immediate assumption Wolfe made when confronted with this data.
The same assumption we always make.
Exactly. It is the exact same assumption we make when we see a successful outlier in business or sports.
Yeah.
We think, oh, it must be their individual choices.
Right.
Wolfe assumes it must be their specific diet or, their strict exercise regimen or perhaps some superior genetic makeup. He is looking at the individual components.
Let me jump in here because I love this part. He figures, okay, they're Italian immigrants. Right. They must be eating this pristine, super healthy Mediterranean diet.
Right, the olive oil and fish.
Olive oil, fresh fish, leafy greens. Nope. When they looked at the diets, it was a cardiologist's absolute nightmare.
It was so bad.
They are cooking with heavy lard instead of olive oil. They are eating thick pizzas loaded with sausage, pepperoni, and eggs.
Just heavy, heavy food.
And they're eating heavy sweets and biscotti year-round, not just on holidays. A whopping 41% of their daily calories came straight from fat.
And they certainly were not hitting the gym or doing morning yoga either.
Definitely not.
This was a town of people who worked in slate quarries. It was grueling work, sure, but they weren't engaging in cardiovascular exercise.
Plus the smoking.
Oh yeah, they smoked heavily. Unfiltered cigarettes too. And many of them struggled with obesity. So Wolf thinks, okay, if it isn't diet and it isn't exercise, it just has to be genetics.
But the genetics theory falls apart too, right?
Completely.
Because he tracked down relatives of the Rosatans living in other parts of the United States. You look at their health records, and they didn't have the same magical immunity.
They were dying of heart disease at the same rate as everyone else in the country.
So then he thinks maybe it's the specific location, the water or something.
Yeah, but he checks the neighboring towns in Pennsylvania, Bangor, and Nazareth. Same climate, same water supply, same geography. Their heart disease rates were 3 times higher than Rosato's.
Okay, so let's look at the mechanism here. If you eliminate diet, if you eliminate exercise, if you eliminate genetics, and you eliminate geography, what is keeping these people alive?
Wolf and a sociologist named John Brune finally realized that the answer wasn't inside the bodies of the Rosans.
Where was it?
The answer was Rosato itself. It was the community.
I mean, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. How does a community literally stop your arteries from clogging?
It comes down to the physiological impact of stress. The Rosatans had essentially transplanted the close-knit, highly protective culture of their southern Italian village directly to the hills of Pennsylvania.
What did that look like day to day?
When Wolf and Brune walked the streets, they saw multi-generational homes. Grandparents weren't put in nursing homes.
Oh, they live with the family.
Right, they lived under the same roof and were deeply respected. They saw people constantly stopping to chat in Italian on the street, cooking massive meals for their neighbors.
Just a huge support network.
Exactly. They counted 22 separate civic organizations in a town of just under 2,000 people.
Wait, 22? In a town that small, that means literally everyone is involved in something. Everyone belongs.
Precisely. It was a fiercely egalitarian ethos. The wealthy didn't flaunt their success, and the poor weren't ostracized.
That's rare.
It is. And this profound social support system functioned as an invisible shield against the stress of the modern world.
Because stress kills.
Right. When you have that level of deep daily social connection, your baseline cortisol levels drop.
Yeah.
Your sympathetic nervous system isn't constantly in that fight or flight mode.
Wow.
And biologically, that lack of chronic stress prevents the inflammation that leads to arteriosclerosis. They were healthy because of the world they had created for themselves, not because of individual discipline.
And this brings us perfectly to the core thesis of our entire deep dive today. Just as Stuart Wolf proved that you cannot understand a person's physical health by only looking at their individual body, we are going to prove that you cannot understand a person's success by only looking at their individual brain or their individual hustle.
It's all about the context.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If we want to understand the tallest oak tree in the forest, we can't just look at the acorn it came from and praise its genetic ambition.
No, you have to look at the sunlight that warmed it.
And the soil that fed it, and the very lucky fact that no lumberjack happened to cut it down when it was a sapling.
Exactly. The individual is just the acorn. The environment is what determines the height of the tree.
So true.
So if success is a product of our environment and the systems we are placed in, the most logical place to begin our investigation is the very beginning of a person's life.
The arbitrary rules.
Specifically, yes, the completely arbitrary rules we place on children before they even know they are competing in the world.
Which takes us to Canada. And let me tell you, as someone who watches a lot of sports, there is nothing that claims to be more of a pure meritocracy than Canadian hockey.
Oh, it's practically a religion up there.
It really is. From the time these kids are toddlers on the ice, they are evaluated, sifted, and sorted.
The absolute best get pushed to the next level.
And the rest get left behind. By their mid-teens, the absolute elite are channeled into the major junior A league. The prevailing wisdom is that if you make it there, you are the best of the best.
It shouldn't matter who your parents are or how much money you have.
Right. It's supposed to be a pure, unadulterated individual merit on the ice. Or, well, at least that's the myth.
Right. And if that myth were true, if Canadian hockey were pure meritocracy, we would expect to see the birth dates of those elite players randomly distributed throughout the calendar year.
Because talent doesn't care about the calendar.
Exactly. Talent, speed, and agility do not care what month you were born. A genius on the ice could be born in June just as easily as in December.
But that is not what the data shows, is it?
Not at all.
In the mid-1980s, a Canadian psychologist named Roger Barnsley was at an elite junior hockey game with his wife, Paula.
She was the one who noticed it.
Yeah, she is looking at the program, just reading the player roster, and she points out something that seems completely insane. She says to him, "Do you notice when these kids were born?"
Practically everyone on the team was born in January, February, or March.
Barnsley initially thought she was crazy. I mean, it sounded like astrology.
Yeah, horoscopes for hockey.
Right. But he was a researcher, so he went and looked at the data. He looked at every professional player he could find. He looked at the entire Ontario Junior Hockey League.
And what did he find?
He discovered what is essentially an iron law of Canadian hockey. In any elite group, roughly 40% of the players will be born between January and March.
40%.
40%. 30% will be born between April and June, 20% between July and September, and only 10% between October and December.
It's a perfect descending curve.
I want to make this real for you listening. I have the roster of the 2007 Medicine Hat Tigers right here from our source material. This is the team that went to the national championship.
Elite of the elite.
Listen to some of these birth dates. Scott Wasden, January 4. Darren Helm, January 21st. Tyler Swiston, January 15. Trevor Glass, January 22. Breton Cameron, January 26.
It just keeps going.
17 out of the 25 players on this elite championship roster were born in the first 4 months of the year. This isn't a statistical anomaly.
It's a systemic design flaw.
Why is this happening?
It is entirely due to a structural mechanism. In Canada, the eligibility cutoff for age class hockey is January 1st.
Okay, let me stop you there because we really need to unpack how a simple date on a calendar warps an entire sport.
Yeah, let's look at it practically.
Imagine you have two 9-year-old boys trying out for an all-star traveling team. One was born on January 2nd, the other on December 31st.
They are technically the exact same age in the eyes of the hockey league.
They are both 9-year-olds on paper, but biologically.
The boy born in January is almost a full 12 months older than the boy born in December.
And at 9 years old, a 12-month gap in physical maturity is absolutely massive.
It's a lifetime at that age. The January boy is likely taller, he has more muscle mass, his hand-eye coordination is vastly more developed simply because his brain and body have had nearly an extra year to mature.
It's like mandating that every 9-year-old must wear a size 5 shoe.
Good analogy.
The kids whose feet randomly happen to fit get to run the race, and the kids who are a size 4 just have to sit on the bench and are told they're bad at running.
Exactly.
But here is the tragedy of it. The coaches look at that bigger, more coordinated 9-year-old born in January, and they don't see a kid who is simply older.
Right, they see talent.
They confuse biological maturity with innate God-given talent. So they pick him for the elite rep squad, and they cut the December kid.
And this initiates what sociologists call the Matthew effect.
Where's that term come from?
The term comes from the book of Matthew in the Bible. It says, "For unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath."
So the rich get richer.
Exactly. In sociological terms, it describes a cumulative advantage.
So how does this accumulative advantage actually work on the ice? What happens to that January kid after he makes the elite team?
Everything changes for him. Because he was placed on the elite squad, he now gets vastly better coaching.
Better resources.
His teammates are better, which elevates his own level of play. He plays 50 to 75 games a season instead of the 20 games the recreational kids play.
Wow, that's a huge difference in ice time.
Huge. He practices twice or 3 times as much. Initially, his only real advantage was that he was a little bit older.
Just a few months.
But over the course of 3, 4, 5 years, because of all that superior coaching, the thousands of extra hours of practice, and the psychological boost of being told he is special.
He actually becomes better?
Yes, he actually becomes genuinely better.
The false assumption literally becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We plant 2 identical seeds, but we give one a month's head start in a temperature-controlled greenhouse.
And then we praise the greenhouse flower.
Right. We pat ourselves on the back and praise it for its superior genetic ambition. It's absurd. We are fundamentally misdiagnosing what talent looks like.
We really are.
And if you are listening to this thinking, well, that's just a weird Canadian hockey quirk, you need to brace yourself.
Yes, because this is not confined to hockey. European soccer operates under the exact same accumulative advantage.
Really? The same month cutoff.
Well, the cutoff date for international junior soccer used to be August 1st. And historically, the data showed a massive, overwhelming skew toward players born in August, September, and October.
So it shifted with the date.
Exactly. Today, the international cutoff is January 1st. If you look at the 2007 Czech national junior soccer team roster from our source material, it is the exact same story as the Medicine Hat Tigers.
Just dominating early year birthdays.
Practically everyone is born in the first few months of the year. There's not a single player born in July, October, November, or December on that entire national roster.
Which means the system is incredibly, embarrassingly inefficient. We are effectively taking half of our athletic talent pool and throwing it in the trash just because their mothers went into labor in the wrong half of the calendar.
It's a massive waste of human potential.
But here's where it gets really terrifying. This doesn't just happen in sports, it happens in our schools.
The implications for education are profound and, frankly, quite disturbing.
How so?
Economists Kelly Bedard and Elizabeth Dewey looked at math and science test scores for children around the world utilizing the TIMSS data.
Okay.
They found that among fourth graders, the oldest children in a given grade scored significantly higher, up to 12 percentile points higher than the youngest children in that exact same grade.
Wait, 12 percentile points in fourth grade is huge? That is the literal difference between qualifying for the gifted and talented program and being left in the standard educational track.
Precisely. And just like the hockey coaches, our educational systems do ability grouping very early in childhood.
Like tracking.
We have advanced reading groups and advanced math groups in kindergarten and first grade. Teachers, who are totally well-meaning, look at a classroom of a 5-year-old.
I see the differences.
They see the child who is nearly 6, who can sit still longer, hold a pencil better, and articulate thoughts more clearly. They confuse that biological maturity with innate intelligence.
Just like the coaches.
Just like the coaches, they put the older kid in the advanced stream.
And the Matthew effect kicks in again?
Exactly.
That older kid in the advanced reading group gets better instruction. They are surrounded by other capable peers. But maybe most importantly, their self-image changes.
They start to believe they are smarter.
They are told they are smart. The younger kid, who is struggling simply because their brain is 11 months less developed, internalizes that they are dumb.
And this arbitrary advantage doesn't just wash out over time as they grow up.
No, it compounds, doesn't it?
It compounds heavily. Dewey and Bedard looked at 4-year colleges in the United States. Students belonging to the youngest group in their childhood class were underrepresented at the university level by about 11.6%.
That is wild. Think about the gravity of that.
It's systemic.
That initial, completely arbitrary cutoff date disadvantage from kindergarten literally dictates who goes to a 4-year college, who enters the professional middle class, and who doesn't.
It's entirely structural.
I want you, the listener, to stop and really think about this for a second. Think about your own early schooling or maybe your early career. How many times did an early arbitrary categorization like a standardized test score in 3rd grade or a performance review in your first month on a new job when you barely knew the software dictate your entire trajectory?
More often than we'd like to admit.
We love to think we operate in a meritocracy, selecting the best and the brightest. But the data proves that in many cases, we are just blindly selecting the oldest.
The only country in their study that did not suffer from this massive developmental skew was Denmark.
Oh, why is that?
Because Denmark has a national educational policy against ability grouping until the age of 10.
Wow, that's smart.
They wait until the physical and cognitive maturity differences have largely evened out before they start sorting kids based on ability.
They wait until the race is actually fair before they start handing out medals.
Exactly.
So, the Matthew effect shows us how a tiny, lucky advantage like a birthday leads to more practice, better coaching, and superior opportunities.
Right.
Which perfectly transitions us into our next massive question. If practice and opportunity are the real drivers of success, just how much practice does it actually take to become a true outlier? And more importantly, who actually gets the privilege of putting in that time?
This brings us to a concept that has become deeply embedded in our modern culture, though it is very frequently misunderstood.
The 10,000-hour rule.
Yes, the 10,000-hour rule. To truly understand it, we have to look at the foundational work of psychologist K. Anders Ericsson. In the early 1990s, Ericsson and his colleagues conducted a fascinating, highly detailed study at Berlin's elite Academy of Music.
I am naturally skeptical of this one, so let's break down the methodology. What exactly did they do?
They took the school's violinists and divided them into three distinct groups. First, the stars, the potential world-class soloists.
Okay.
Second, the merely good ones, who would likely play in a symphony but not as soloists. And third, the students who were on track to become public school music teachers.
Got it. 3 tiers.
They asked all of these students to map out their entire practice history. Since the moment you first pick up the violin, how many hours have you practiced?
Now, if the lone genius myth is real, you would expect the world-class soloist to have practiced less, right?
That would be the assumption.
Because they just have this divine, innate gift for pitch and rhythm. They shouldn't have to work as hard, but that isn't what happened.
Not at all. The results were striking in their uniformity. Almost everyone in the study started playing around age 5, and in those early years, they all practiced roughly the same amount, about 2 or 3 hours a week.
Sounds normal.
But around age 8, a massive divergence began. The students who would eventually become the elite soloists started practicing more.
How much more?
6 hours a week at age 9, 8 hours at age 12, 16 hours at age 14, up until age 20, when they were practicing well over 30 hours a week.
It's a full-time job at that point.
Exactly. By age 20, the elite performers had each totaled roughly 10,000 hours of practice over their lifetimes.
10,000 hours.
The good students had totaled 8,000 hours. The future music teachers had logged just over 4,000 hours.
So wait, let me push back here. You're telling me if I, a guy with average coordination and 0 musical background, practice violin for 10,000 hours starting tomorrow, I could play at Carnegie Hall? That can't be right. There has to be some baseline talent, doesn't there?
That is a crucial distinction. You do need a baseline of physical coordination, a baseline ear for pitch, and enough musical aptitude to get accepted into an elite academy like the one in Berlin in the first place.
Right, I'm not getting in there.
Probably not. But here is Ericsson's profound finding. Once a musician has enough baseline ability to get into a top music school, the only thing distinguishing the elite from the rest of the pack is just how intensely they work.
Seriously?
Seriously. Ericsson couldn't find any naturals. No one who floated to the top, practicing only a fraction of the time. And he couldn't find any grinds. People who worked harder than everyone else but lacked the talent to break through.
Wow.
At the highest level, talent is just the entry ticket. Practice is the entire journey.
And 10,000 hours seems to be this magic threshold for true world-class expertise. The neurologist Daniel Levitin points out that this holds true across wildly different disciplines.
Oh, it's everywhere.
Composers, professional basketball players, fiction writers, ice skaters, chess grandmasters. 10,000 hours is roughly 10 years of hard, dedicated practice.
Yep.
Even Mozart, the quintessential child prodigy who we think of as being touched by God, didn't produce what critics consider a true masterwork until he had been composing for 10 years.
Right. His early works were largely just arrangements of other composers' music.
Yeah.
He had to put in his 10,000 hours just like anyone else.
Okay, but this is where the popular understanding of the 10,000-hour rule completely misses the point. People put it on motivational posters in offices. Just grind it out, put in your 10,000 hours, and you'll be a genius.
Which is a huge misinterpretation.
It is, because the 10,000-hour rule isn't actually a story about bootstrapping. When you really analyze it, it is a story about immense privilege and unbelievably rare opportunity.
Absolutely, because 10,000 hours is an enormous, almost incomprehensible amount of time for a young person to accumulate.
You can't just find that time.
You cannot achieve it by yourself as a teenager or a young adult. You need a supportive infrastructure. You need parents who can afford to buy the instrument and pay for lessons. You need financial stability.
If you are a teenager who has to work a part-time job at a grocery store after school to help your parents pay rent, you simply are not getting those practice hours in.
Not a chance. Your 10,000 hours will take you until you are 40 years old. To hit that number by age 20, you need extraordinary, lucky opportunities to subsidize that time.
Let's look at a concrete example of this subsidized practice. Let's look at Bill Joy, who is often called the Edison of the Internet.
A great example.
He was a brilliant kid, undoubtedly. He rewrote Unix, he co-founded Sun Microsystems, he invented Java. But his real hidden advantage, it was stumbling into the University of Michigan in 1971 as a 16-year-old freshman.
To understand why that was an advantage, we had to vividly recreate the context of the early 1970s. In 1971, computer programming was incredibly tedious.
Oh, it was awful.
You didn't have a screen, you used cardboard punch cards, you would spend hours meticulously punching holes in these cards to write a program.
Just one typo ruins it.
Exactly. Then you handed a massive stack of cards to a white-coated operator, and you waited. Sometimes you waited hours, sometimes a whole day, for an appointment on the mainframe computer.
That's excruciating.
And if you made a single typographical error, if one hole was punched wrong, the program crashed, and you had to start the entire torturous process over.
It was basically impossible to get 10,000 hours of practice that way. It would be like trying to write a novel by mailing one letter at a time to a publisher and waiting weeks for a reply. It was a nightmare of patience.
Exactly. But the University of Michigan was one of the very first universities in the entire world to switch to a time-sharing system.
Timeshare.
Time-sharing meant multiple people could connect to the mainframe simultaneously using terminals. You could sit at a teletype machine, type a command, and get instant feedback in real time.
So the feedback loop shrinks to nothing.
It turned programming from a slow, agonizing process into high-speed chess. You could learn, iterate, and fix mistakes instantly. Bill Joy just happened to enroll at one of the only places on planet Earth where a 17-year-old could program interactively.
And the lucky breaks didn't stop there. The computer center at Michigan was open 24 hours a day, which meant Joy could basically live there.
Which he did.
But crucially, computer time costs money, and students were given a strict budget. You only got about an hour of computer time before your account ran out. But Joy and his friends found a bug in the software.
A very convenient bug.
They realized that if they typed TK into the terminal, the system's accounting program would glitch and wouldn't charge them for the time.
Think about the magnitude of that loophole. Bill Joy could sit there all night, every night, coding for free. He was accumulating hours at a rate that was impossible for 99.9% of the world's population.
Just massive subsidized practice.
By the time he went to grad school at Berkeley and helped rewrite the Unix operating system, he had already hit his 10,000 hours.
He was a genius, yes, but his genius was completely subsidized by circumstance. A time-sharing mainframe and a software bug bought him his expertise.
It's the same pattern everywhere.
We see the exact same pattern with the Beatles. We tend to view the Beatles as pure artistic inspiration. 4 guys from Liverpool who just inherently knew how to write perfect pop songs.
Right, the spark of genius.
But their true crucible, the thing that forged them, wasn't divine inspiration. It was Hamburg, Germany in 1960.
Yes. A club owner in Hamburg named Bruno Koschmider brought them over to play in his strip clubs in the red light district. And this wasn't about prestige or artistic development.
It's survival.
It was about sheer, unadulterated volume. In Liverpool, bands played 1-hour sets of their best songs. In Hamburg, the club owners wanted non-stop music to keep the patrons drinking.
So how long did they play?
The Beatles were forced to play 8 hours a night, 7 days a week.
8 hours a night. I can't even imagine the physical toll that takes. Over a year and a half, they traveled to Hamburg 5 times. They played 270 nights.
They had to get creative.
They had to learn cover songs from every conceivable genre just to fill the time. They learned crowd psychology. They built immense physical stamina.
And by the time they hit America.
Right. By the time they had their massive breakthrough in America in 1964, they had performed live an estimated 1,200 times. Most rock bands today don't play 1,200 shows in their entire career.
That sheer volume of subsidized forced practice is what made them sound like no one else.
And perhaps the most famous, undeniable example of the 10,000-hour rule is Bill Gates. We think of Gates as the ultimate whiz kid, a guy who dropped out of Harvard because he was just too smart for school.
But if we trace his history, we can count a cascade of distinct, incredibly lucky breaks that gifted him his 10,000 hours of practice.
I'm going to walk through these slowly because when you stack them up, the odds are astronomical. First, he was sent to Lakeside, an elite private school in Seattle.
Okay, 1.
Second, in 1968, the school's Mothers Club used rummage sale money to buy a time-sharing terminal for the students. Let that sink in. Most colleges didn't have computer clubs in 1968, let alone 8th graders.
That terminal connected them directly to a mainframe in downtown Seattle. It was essentially giving a child a spaceship in 1968.
Right. Third, when the Mothers Club money ran out, one of the parents happened to work at a company called C Cubed. That company needed weekend testers for their software, giving Gates free time on their mainframe.
That's 3.
Fourth, he happened to find out about a company called ISI that needed a payroll program written, and they let Gates and his friends write it in exchange for computer time.
4.
Fifth, Gates happened to live within walking distance of the University of Washington. Sixth, he figured out that the university had free computer time available between 3 and 6 a.m., so he would sneak out of his house in the middle of the night to program.
That's a ridiculous amount of access.
Seventh, a technology company called TRW desperately needed specialized programmers who understood the specific software Gates had been using at ISI. Eighth, the people at TRW happened to call a guy who knew Gates from his previous work.
And 9th.
And ninth, incredibly, Lakeside High School actually allowed Gates to leave school during his senior spring term under the guise of an independent study to go write code for TRW full-time.
It is unbelievable.
Every single one of these 9 opportunities has one thing in common. They bought Bill Gates time. Time to practice, time to fail, time to learn.
By the time he dropped out of Harvard to start Microsoft, he had been programming practically nonstop for 7 consecutive years. He was way past 10,000 hours.
As Gates himself admitted to Gladwell, if there were 50 teenagers in the entire world who had that kind of exposure to software development at that specific age, he would be stunned.
So Gates and Joy and the Beatles didn't just have brains and musical ears. They were subsidized by a cascade of lucky breaks, financial loopholes, and historical accidents.
But this brings us to a really critical, somewhat philosophical question. If intense preparation, subsidized time, and lucky circumstances can effectively manufacture mastery, where does that leave raw, unadulterated genius?
The IQ question.
I'm talking about the kind of intellect that is just off the charts. If you have an IQ of, say, 190, do you even need the 10,000 hours? Does raw processing power override the need for practice and social advantage?
To answer that, we have to look at the tragic, fascinating story of Chris Langan. By many accounts, and by his own admission, Langan has been called the smartest man in America.
What's his IQ?
His IQ is estimated to be 195.
Just to give you listeners some perspective, the average IQ is 100. Albert Einstein's IQ was estimated to be around 150. So Chris Langan's brain is processing information at a level that defies human description.
Exactly. His cognitive abilities were apparent almost immediately. He started talking at 6 months old.
6 months.
He taught himself to read at age 3 simply by listening to the Sunday comics being read on the radio. At 16, he was reading Bertrand Russell's famously dense philosophical and mathematical treatise, Principia Mathematica.
Wow.
When he took the SAT, he fell asleep during the test, woke up, and still got a perfect score.
Okay, so with an IQ of 195, a guy who reads Bertrand Russell as a teenager, he must be running the world right. He must be a billionaire tech founder or a Nobel laureate in physics or running a massive think tank.
Quite the opposite, unfortunately. Despite his staggering, once-in-a-generation intellect, Langan spent much of his adult life working in obscurity.
Doing what?
He worked as a bouncer in a bar, he worked as a farmhand, he did construction. His academic career, which should have been his launching pad, derailed almost immediately.
Why? What happened?
Well, he went to Reed College in Oregon on a full scholarship. But he lost that scholarship because his mother, who was deeply poor and overwhelmed, forgot to fill out a financial aid form on time.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
Langan tried to appeal, but the administration was rigid, and he had to drop out. Later, he enrolled at Montana State University. He lived off campus, and one winter day, his car broke down.
Oh, okay.
He couldn't get to his morning classes. So he went to his professor and the dean, and he asked to simply transfer to the afternoon sections of the exact same classes so he could hitchhike in.
Seems reasonable.
The administration refused his request. Frustrated by the bureaucracy, Langan dropped out and never finished his degree.
Wait, hold on. I'm getting frustrated just hearing this. The smartest man in America ended up working as a bouncer because of a missed deadline on a form and a broken-down transmission on a car.
It sounds absurd, but yes.
Why didn't he just advocate for himself? Why didn't he sit in the dean's office until they fixed it? To understand why he couldn't, let's compare him to another verified genius. Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist who led the Manhattan Project and built the atomic bomb.
Yes, the contrast is incredibly illuminating. Oppenheimer was also a genius. But when he was a graduate student at Cambridge University, he struggled with depression and grew intensely jealous of his tutor, a man named Patrick Blackett.
And what did he do?
In a fit of instability, Oppenheimer took chemicals from the laboratory and intentionally poisoned an apple, leaving it on Blackett's desk.
It was literally an attempted murder. He tried to poison his teacher, so what happened? Did he get expelled? Did he go to British prison?
No, the university found out, but Oppenheimer's parents intervened. They negotiated with the administration. Ultimately, Oppenheimer was merely put on probation and assigned to see a psychiatrist in London.
He wasn't even kicked out.
He wasn't expelled. In fact, he went on to get his PhD. Later in life, despite having absolutely no administrative background and despite having a history of left-wing political associations that the military hated, Oppenheimer managed to talk his way into convincing General Leslie Groves to make him the director of the Manhattan Project.
Okay, so what is the fundamental difference here? Why does one genius end up a farmhand over a scheduling conflict, while another genius attempts murder, gets a slap on the wrist, and ends up the father of the atomic bomb?
The difference lies in a fundamental societal misunderstanding of what intelligence actually is. We obsess over analytical intelligence. We obsess over IQ.
Right, the test scores.
Lewis Terman, a famous psychologist at Stanford who helped invent the modern IQ test, believed that IQ was the ultimate predictor of a person's worth. He tried 4,470 children with IQs over 140, his so-called termites, expecting them to become a generation of heroic leaders, Nobel winners, and titans of industry.
But they didn't, did they?
No. The results were incredibly mixed. A few became successful professionals, but many struggled, working in menial jobs, suffering from alcoholism, and living very ordinary lives. Terman was forced to conclude that intellect and achievement are far from perfectly correlated.
Because Terman missed what's known as the threshold effect.
Exactly. Let's use a basketball analogy. You absolutely need to be tall to play professional basketball. A 5'2" person is not making it to the NBA.
Unless they're Muggsy Bugs, but generally, yeah.
Right. But once you hit a certain threshold, let's say about 6'2" or 6'3" additional height stops being the defining factor of success. A player who's 6'8" isn't automatically better than a player who is 6'6". At that level, speed, court vision, and agility take over. You just have to be tall enough to get in the game.
Intelligence works the exact same way. Once your IQ hits roughly 120, which is essentially enough processing power to get through a competitive graduate program, additional IQ points do not translate into more real-world success.
The numbers level off.
A scientist with an IQ of 130 is statistically just as likely to win a Nobel Prize as a scientist with an IQ of 180. IQ is just the entry ticket. It is a threshold.
And beyond that threshold, entirely different forms of intelligence dictate who succeeds and who fails. To illustrate this, psychologists look at different types of testing. An IQ test is a convergence test.
Meaning you converge on one answer.
Right. You are given a complex puzzle, and you have to sort through possibilities to converge on a single, objectively right answer. But there are also divergence tests, which measure creativity, imagination, and adaptability.
Oh, I love these.
A classic divergence test asks, write down as many different uses that you can think of for a brick and a blanket.
I love this divergence test. Gladwell gives this example of a student named Poole. Poole gave amazing, vivid answers. For a brick, he said you can use it for building things, for smashing windows in an emergency, as a weapon, as a pendulum weight.
Very creative.
For a blanket, he said, keeping warm, smothering a fire, tying it to trees for a hammock, as a makeshift parachute, a tourniquet. Then there was another student, Florence, who had a vastly higher IQ than Poole.
But what did Florence say?
When asked the same question, Florence just answered, building things and keeping warm. Florence had immense analytical processing power, but zero imagination.
And that imagination, that ability to read situations, adapt to your environment, and manipulate variables, leads us to what the psychologist Robert Sternberg calls practical intelligence.
What's the definition of that?
Practical intelligence is knowing what to say, knowing whom to say it to, knowing when to say it, and knowing exactly how to say it for maximum effect. It is procedural. It is social savvy.
Like reading the room?
Exactly. It is the ability to navigate bureaucracy and negotiate for what you want. And crucially, general analytical intelligence, your IQ and practical intelligence, are orthogonal, meaning they're completely independent variables.
So one doesn't guarantee the other.
Right. You can possess a staggering IQ and possess absolutely zero practical intelligence.
Which brings us right back to Chris Langan and Robert Oppenheimer. Is our cultural obsession with standardized testing and IQ scores actively blinding us to the kind of intelligence that actually changes the world?
It seemed like it.
Oppenheimer didn't build the atomic bomb because he was better at calculus than Chris Langan. He built it because he knew how to manage generals, politicians, and massive scientific egos.
Yes.
IQ is just the horsepower of the engine. Practical intelligence is the transmission. Without a transmission, you are just revving your engine in neutral, making a lot of noise, but going absolutely nowhere. Just like Langan fighting with his college administration and getting nowhere.
This naturally raises the most important question of this segment. Where does practical intelligence come from? If it isn't innate like an IQ ceiling, how do we get it?
The environment again.
The data points clearly to family background and social class. The sociologist Annette Lareau conducted a groundbreaking study on this. She embedded herself with families from different socioeconomic backgrounds.
And she noticed two different parenting styles,
Yeah.
right?
She found that wealthier, middle-class parents engage in a very specific style of parenting called concerted cultivation. They constantly engage their children in conversation. They reason with them. They explain the why behind rules.
Lots of negotiation.
And most importantly, they teach their children to advocate for themselves and to politely challenge authority figures.
Right. Lareau observed a young, middle-class boy named Alex Williams going to the doctor for a checkup. Before they even step into the clinic, his mother is coaching him in the car. She says, "Alex, you need to ask the doctor about those bumps under your arm."
Preparing him to speak up.
When they are in the exam room, Alex doesn't just passively sit there. He interacts with the doctor as an equal. He asks questions. He negotiates his care. That is the physical wiring of concerted cultivation taking place in real time.
In stark contrast, poorer parents tend to practice what Lareau calls natural growth. They deeply care for their children, they provide for them, but they leave them to their own devices when it comes to leisure time and adult interactions.
They don't micromanage.
Right, they don't micromanage their development. And crucially, they instill a deep deference to authority. A child raised in a natural growth environment doesn't learn to challenge a doctor or negotiate with a college professor.
Yeah, just listen.
They are taught that authority figures are absolute and you do not talk back or ask for special treatment.
And there is the missing puzzle piece. Robert Oppenheimer grew up in immense, staggering wealth in Manhattan. He attended the Progressive Ethical Culture School. He was entirely steeped in concerted cultivation.
On day one.
He was taught that the world was malleable, that rules were negotiable, and that his voice mattered. Chris Langan grew up in deep, grinding poverty with a highly chaotic, abusive home life. He was raised with natural growth.
Which hurt him later.
When Langan faced a bureaucratic roadblock at Montana State University, he didn't have the practical intelligence to navigate it. He didn't know how to schmooze the dean or plead his case. He just accepted defeat as an inevitable consequence of authority.
When Louis Terman finally analyzed his genius termites in adulthood, after decades of tracking them, he found the exact same socioeconomic divide.
It matched up perfectly.
Completely. The highly successful A group, the lawyers, doctors, and academics, overwhelmingly came from middle and upper-class homes filled with books and concerted cultivation.
And the rest?
The struggling C group, despite having the exact same 140-plus IQs as the A group, almost universally came from the poorest homes. They lacked the practical intelligence that is taught, invisibly, by social class.
So Oppenheimer's massive success wasn't just his brain. It was his specific wealthy upbringing giving him the social transmission he needed. This reveals that the specific era and the specific circumstances we are born into fundamentally shape who we can become.
Timing is everything.
So let's zoom out. Let's pull the camera back from childhood upbringing and look at the broader sweep of macroeconomic history and demographics. Because it turns out the year you are born might actually be the biggest lottery ticket of all.
Let's look at a list compiled of the 75 richest people in human history. This isn't just modern people. This list goes from Cleopatra and the pharaohs, through kings and queens of antiquity, all the way to modern billionaires.
A huge timeline.
If you look closely at that list, an astonishing 14 of those 75 names are Americans born within a very narrow 9-year window in the mid-19th century.
Like who?
You have John D. Rockefeller, born in 1839, Andrew Carnegie, born in 1835,
Yeah.
J.P. Morgan, born in 1837.
Wait, almost 20% of the wealthiest humans to ever walk the earth came from a single generation in a single country born within 9 years of each other? How is that statistically possible?
It is entirely because timing is everything. In the 1860s and 1870s, the American economy underwent its greatest transformation in history. Wall Street emerged as a global power, railroads connected the continent, and industrial manufacturing boomed.
The Industrial Revolution hitting its stride.
Exactly. If you were born in the late 1840s, you were too young in the 1860s to take advantage of it. You were just a kid. If you
Yeah.
were born in the 1820s, you were too old. Your mindset was already locked into the pre-Civil War agrarian paradigm.
You're not going to pivot to railroads in your 40s back then.
You weren't going to pivot to building massive industrial monopolies, but if you were born in the mid-1830s, you were in your 20s, just as the rules of the entire global economy were being completely rewritten.
You had the vision, the youthful energy, and the absolute perfect demographic timing. And we see the exact same pattern repeat itself with the Silicon Valley software tycoons in the 20th century.
Yes.
The personal computer revolution essentially began in January 1975 when Popular Electronics magazine ran a cover story on the Altair 8800. It was the first do-it-yourself computer kit.
To capitalize on that specific technological revolution, you couldn't be too old. If you were born before 1952, by 1975 you were 23 or 24.
You probably had a job.
You likely already had a family, a mortgage, and a very comfortable, stable job at a company like IBM working on massive mainframes. You were not going to quit your secure job to play with a $397 hobbyist kit in a garage.
Makes sense.
But you also couldn't be too young. If you were born after 1958, you were still in high school when the Altair dropped. You didn't have the time or the capital to start a company.
The perfect golden window is being born in 1954 or 1955. You would be 20 or 21 in 1975. You were old enough to understand the deeply complex technology, but young enough to be living in a dorm room with no mortgage, no kids, and the freedom to take a massive, life-altering risk.
Let's check the dates on those tech titans.
Look at the birth dates. Bill Gates, 1955. Paul Allen, 1953. Steve Ballmer, 1956. Steve Jobs, 1955. Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, 1955. Bill Joy, 1954. The founders of Sun Microsystems, all born in 1954 or 1955.
It is the January 1st hockey cutoff, but for billionaires.
It really is. If you are listening to this right now, ask yourself, what is the demographic lottery ticket for the AI revolution happening right now? Are we currently in a window where 20-year-olds have the advantage because they are native to it? Or is this a game for 40-year-olds who have the capital to invest in the hardware?
It is a fascinating parallel. But the demographic lottery isn't just about technological or industrial revolutions. It can also be about navigating and eventually exploiting systemic discrimination.
Like Joe Flom.
Take the story of Joe Flom. He became the last living named partner of the elite law firm Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen, Katz, which is one of the most powerful, prestigious law firms in the world.
At first glance, Joe Flom's story is the classic, quintessential rags to riches myth. He was Jewish, the son of incredibly poor garment workers in New York, born in the 1930s. He grew up in the Depression.
A very tough start.
He fights his way into Harvard Law School, gets exceptional grades, and becomes an editor of the Law Review. But when he tries to get a job at the elite, white-shoe downtown law firms in New York, the firms representing the big banks and old money, he gets rejected.
Because of who he was.
They literally wouldn't hire him. They didn't hire Jewish lawyers who lacked the right social background or pedigree.
So Flom, brilliant but excluded, is forced to join a scrappy, no-name startup firm. And because the elite white shoe firms considered hostile corporate takeovers and ugly proxy fights to be garbage work, they thought it was ungentlemanly and beneath their dignity, they outsourced all of that aggressive litigation to smaller firms like Flom's.
For 20 years, Joe Flom handled this garbage work. He was getting his 10,000 hours in on proxy fights. But here is the massive irony of his story. The very things that look like absolute crushing disadvantages for Joe Flom, being a religious outsider, getting rejected by the establishment, being forced to take the work no one else wanted, were actually his golden lottery tickets.
Yes, because in the 1970s, the entire financial world shifted. Borrowing money became much easier, markets shifted toward aggressive growth, and suddenly, hostile takeovers became the absolute core of the global economy.
The garbage work became the gold mine.
It went from being fringe garbage work to the most lucrative legal work on the planet. When the white shoe firms finally decided they needed to do this work to survive, they had absolutely no experience. Joe Flom, meanwhile, had 20 years of intense specialized practice. He was the undisputed master of the universe.
It makes you wonder what current disadvantages in today's society are actually secret training grounds. But Flom's success wasn't just about the proxy fights. He had two other massive demographic advantages that he had zero control over. First, he was born in the 1930s, right during the demographic trough of the Great Depression.
This is a crucial, often overlooked point. Because birth rates absolutely plummeted during the economic hardship of the Depression, Flom's generation was incredibly small.
Less competition.
When you went to public school in New York, class sizes were small, the facilities were relatively new, and the teachers were highly qualified because teaching was one of the few stable jobs available. When he entered the job market, the supply of young professionals was very low, but the post-war demand was skyrocketing. He walked into an economy practically begging for his labor.
And his third massive advantage was his parents. They're poor, yes, but they worked in the garment industry. It was grueling, back-breaking work, but it was meaningful work.
By meaningful work, sociologists mean it possessed three specific qualities: autonomy, complexity, and a clear, direct connection between effort and reward.
They weren't just pulling a lever.
Flom's parents weren't just drone laborers pulling a lever on an assembly line. They were essentially entrepreneurs. They had to understand the complexity of fabrics, anticipate fashion trends, negotiate with suppliers, manage their own margins, and physically sell their products.
They were running a business.
They taught their children, by example, that if you work incredibly hard, assert yourself, and use your mind to solve complex problems, you can actually shape the world to your desires.
So, if we look at the reality, to be a wildly successful New York corporate lawyer in the 1970s, you didn't just need grit. You needed to be Jewish. So you would be systematically excluded from the traditional firms and forced to learn takeover law. You needed to be born in the 1930s demographic trough, so you faced less competition. And you needed parents in the garment industry to instill the specific values of meaningful work.
It is a completely invisible web of structural demographic advantages.
We have seen how the economic realities of a specific generation shape success. But history passes down something even more invisible and often vastly more potent than macroeconomic conditions. History passes down our cultural legacies.
The invisible rules we live by.
The attitudes, the reflexes, and the deeply ingrained assumptions about authority handed down by our forebears. And as we'll see, these cultural legacies can quite literally be a matter of life and death.
This takes us into the world of aviation and the terrifying phenomenon of the modern plane crash. When we think of a plane crash, our minds go to Hollywood movies. We imagine an engine exploding at 30,000 feet, a wing violently tearing off in a storm, and the pilot wrestling with the controls.
But that is fundamentally not how commercial jets crash in the modern era. Modern commercial jets are incredibly, almost flawlessly reliable machines.
Plane crashes today are rarely due to a single catastrophic mechanical failure. They're almost always the result of an accumulation of minor difficulties, usually an average of 7 consecutive human errors.
7.
A bad weather call, a slightly missed approach, a fatigue-induced misread of a gauge. And critically, these aren't usually errors of technical flying skill. The pilots know how to fly the plane. They're almost exclusively errors of teamwork and communication.
Specifically, they happen when the captain is flying the plane manually, making a mistake or becoming overwhelmed, and the first officer, the co-pilot, is too intimidated by the captain's authority to clearly and forcefully correct them. This exact dynamic is what led to the tragic crash of Avianca Flight 052 in 1990.
The Avianca flight was headed to New York's Kennedy Airport during a terrible nor'easter storm. The weather was atrocious. They were put into holding patterns by air traffic control 3 separate times, burning massive amounts of fuel.
Just flying in circles.
Their autopilot was broken, so the captain was physically and mentally exhausted from flying a commercial jet manually through high winds for hours. By the time they finally approached Kennedy Airport, they were critically dangerously low on fuel.
The first officer, a man named Mauricio Klotz, was in charge of communicating with New York Air Traffic Control. But Klotz was Colombian, and his communication style was deeply steeped in his cultural legacy. He used what linguists call mitigated speech.
He was softening his language.
Instead of saying, "We have no fuel, our engines are about to flame out, we are declaring an emergency, clear the runway," he said things like, "We'll try once again, we're running out of fuel."
To a low-power distance culture like New York Air Traffic Control, where people are aggressive, direct, and expected to demand what they need, mitigated speech from a pilot doesn't register as "I am in mortal danger." It registers as "I am mildly inconvenienced by this delay."
Because if it was a real emergency, they'd yell.
The controllers in New York didn't see a hierarchical gap. They expected the pilot to forcefully assert command if it was a true emergency. But Klotz, acting as a subordinate to both his captain and the ATC, felt it was deeply disrespectful to demand anything of the authoritative controllers. He tried to politely hint at the danger. The ATC completely missed the urgency of the hint, and the plane literally ran out of gas and crashed into a hillside on Long Island.
And this wasn't an isolated incident. 7 years later, Korean Air Flight 801 crashed into a hill in Guam. The captain was tired, they were approaching the runway in heavy rain, and the airport's glide scope, the electronic beam that guides planes down, was out of service. But the black box transcript is agonizing to read. The first officer and the flight engineer saw the danger. They knew the captain was making a visual error in the rain.
But again, because of their cultural legacy, they used mitigated speech. The first officer said, "Don't you think it rains more? In this area, here."
That sounds like casual chat.
Later, as they were heading straight toward a hill, the flight engineer said, "Captain, the weather radar has helped us a lot." To Western ears, these sound like casual, almost nonsensical observations about the weather.
Hmm.
But in the strict authoritarian hierarchy of Korean culture, these were desperate, blaring alarms.
I am trying to wrap my head around this. Are you saying the co-pilot would literally rather die in a plane crash than insult his boss? That feels extreme to a Western listener.
It sounds extreme to us, but it's perfectly explained by Geert Hofstede's Power Distance Index, or PDI. Hofstede was a psychologist who measured how different cultures relate to hierarchy and authority. Countries like Colombia and South Korea historically have very high PDIs.
So deep respect for authority.
In those cultures, subordinates are deeply conditioned to defer to superiors. The superior's judgment is not to be questioned directly, as it causes massive loss of face. The United States, conversely, has a very low PDI. Subordinates are expected to speak up, push back, and challenge the boss if something is objectively wrong.
So being a highly skilled, technically proficient pilot from a high-power distance culture is actually a deadly combination in a modern aviation emergency because modern cockpits require egalitarian teamwork. So what did Korean Air do? Because their safety record was terrible in the late 90s, they were being banned from international alliances. Did they fire all their pilots and hire Westerners?
No. They brought in an outsider, an American aviation expert named David Greenberg. And Greenberg didn't change their flight manuals. He didn't teach them how to fly the plane better. He changed their language.
That is just incredible to me.
Greenberg mandated that all cockpit communication and all training be conducted exclusively in English. It was a brilliant structural solution to a cultural problem. By speaking English, the Korean pilots were essentially given an alternate identity.
A new persona.
They were freed from the incredibly complex hierarchical gradients built into the Korean language, where you have to choose different verb endings depending on the social status of the person you were talking to. English allowed them to be direct. They could bypass hundreds of years of cultural programming just by changing the language they spoke at work.
It is fascinating that the solution wasn't fly better, it was speak a different language. It is like putting on a theatrical mask. By changing the language, they literally changed their psychology. They were, as Greenberg put it, renormed out of their high PDI cultural legacy. It proves that cultural legacies are incredibly powerful, they dictate how we react under stress, but they aren't permanent prisons. We can recognize them, and we can engineer systems to work around them.
And this brings us to a much more uplifting, though equally profound example of a cultural legacy. If a legacy can cause an airplane to crash, can a different kind of legacy propel a child to the top of their class? Let's look at mathematics and the persistent global stereotype that Asian students are inherently genetically better at math.
Let's do a test right now for everyone listening. I'm going to read a list of numbers. I want you to recite them back in your head. Ready? 4, 8, 5, 3, 9, 7, 6. If you are an English speaker, research shows you have about a 50% chance of remembering that sequence perfectly. But if you are a Chinese speaker, you have nearly a 100% chance. Why? Because human memory loops hold about 2 seconds of audio.
English number words are relatively long and clumsy. It takes a fraction of a second longer to say 7 than it does to say the Chinese equivalent. Chinese number words are remarkably brief, mostly single syllables. You can fit all 7 of those digits into a 2-second memory loop comfortably. Furthermore, Asian number systems are perfectly transparent and logical.
Right. In English, we have these weird arbitrary words. We say 11 or 12 or 20 words that give a child absolutely no clue about the math inside them. In Asian languages, the system is strictly logical. They say 10-1 and 10-2. So if you ask an English-speaking 7-year-old to add 37 plus 22, they have to hear the words, convert the words to numbers in their head, do the math, and translate it back to English words. It is clunky.
But if you ask an Asian child,
they are asked to add 3 10s 7 and 2 10s 2. The answer, 5 10s 9, is literally embedded right in the linguistic structure.
Because of this linguistic quirk, Asian children learn to count much faster, and they understand fractions conceptually much earlier than Western children. Math isn't this arbitrary, clumsy code they have to memorize and decipher. It makes intrinsic logical sense from day one. Because it makes sense, they don't feel the same bafflement and frustration Western children do. So they enjoy it more, they try harder, and a virtuous circle of practice and confidence begins.
But the linguistic advantage is only half the story. The other half goes back hundreds of years to the mud of the rice paddies.
Historically, Western agriculture is mechanically oriented. You plant wheat or corn in the spring, you harvest it in the fall, and you leave the fields completely fallow in the winter. It involves bursts of intense labor, followed by long periods of rest.
Right, there's big off-season.
But southern Chinese rice agriculture is fundamentally skill-oriented and relentlessly demanding. You don't have extra land to let fields go fallow, and you can't use big machinery in a terraced paddy. To increase your yield, you have to weed more diligently, you have to fertilize better, you have to manage water levels perfectly every single day. It requires extreme, painstaking diligence, essentially 360 days a year.
There is a Chinese proverb Gladwell quotes, "No one who can rise before dawn 360 days a year fails to make his family rich." The cultural legacy of the rice paddy is a deep, historically ingrained belief that hard work, persistence, and meticulous attention to detail are intrinsically linked to meaningful reward. You control your yield through effort.
And we can see this exact cultural legacy show up in international math testing today. An educational researcher named Erling Boe stumbled upon a massive, almost unbelievable discovery. The TIMSS math test, the global standard for evaluating students, comes with a very long, tedious 120-question background questionnaire that asks about their parents, their study habits, their hobbies. Boe found that you can perfectly predict a country's ranking on the complex math test without looking at a single math answer.
Wait, really?
You just rank the countries by how many questions their students were willing to answer on the tedious, boring background questionnaire?
That is insane. You're saying stamina predicts math scores. The countries whose students have the cultural persistence to sit still, focus, and meticulously finish a boring survey like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore are the exact same countries that dominate the complex math test. We look at Asian math superiority and think genetics or IQ. But it is actually linguistics and agriculture.
It's all about persistence.
It is the legacy of the rice paddy translating into a willingness to stare at a brutal algebra problem for 22 minutes, trying different angles, instead of giving up after 30 seconds like a frustrated Western student. We have been looking at the brain for the answer when we should have been looking at the calendar and the dictionary.
Which naturally leads us to look at the American education system. We built our school calendar on the legacy of Western agriculture. We have long summer vacations so kids could theoretically help with the harvest, which makes no sense in a modern industrial society. A sociologist named Carl Alexander looked at test scores for public school students in Baltimore, and what he found completely destroys our assumptions about why public schools fail.
Alexander tested kids in September when they arrived, and then again in June when they left. He tracked them across socioeconomic lines. He found that during the actual school year, poor kids and wealthy kids learn at the exact same rate. Let me repeat that for everyone listening. The schools themselves are actually working. The poor kids in Baltimore were absorbing information just as fast as the rich kids from September to June.
But then summer vacation happens. The wealthy kids go to enrichment camps, they read books, they visit museums, they travel, they experience that concerted cultivation we talked about earlier. Their brains stay active. The poorer kids don't have those resources. They stay home, they watch TV, they lose their routines. Over the summer, the wealthy kids' reading scores actually jump up, while the poorer kids' scores drop significantly. The entire massive achievement gap in American education happens almost entirely during summer vacation.
If the school year went year-round, poor kids and rich kids would graduate high school at practically the exact same academic level. So how do we fix it? We look at a program like KIPP, the Knowledge is Power program, in the inner cities. KIPP takes the legacy of the rice paddy and aggressively applies it to American education.
KPP schools recognize the structural disadvantage, so they extend the school day from 7:25 a.m. to 5:00 p.m. They have mandatory Saturday classes, they mandate homework over the summer, they drastically shorten summer vacation. They give these kids the sheer volume of time they need to actually learn, to digest the complex material, without the time pressure that makes kids panic and think they aren't math people.
Gladwell profiles a key IPP student named Marita in the Bronx. She wakes up at 5:45 a.m., goes to school all day, comes home, and does homework until midnight. It is grueling. Marita's giving up her weekends, her evenings, a normal middle school life of hanging out with friends. It is what Gladwell calls Marita's bargain. She has to shed the cultural legacy of her neighborhood and adopt this new, intense rice paddy legacy of the KPP school in order to succeed.
And the data shows it works. The vast majority of Keep IPP graduates go on to college, often the first in their families to do so. They are being given a structural advantage, the gift of subsidized time, persistent culture, and structural support to replace the arbitrary systemic disadvantages they were born into.
So let's bring this deep dive full circle. We have traveled from the healthy, communal, lard-eating streets of Roseto to the icy, age-biased hockey rinks of Canada. We've gone from the 24-hour timeshare computer labs of Michigan to the frantic, tragically polite cockpits of falling airplanes over Guam. And we've moved from the ancient rice paddies of southern China to a grueling charter school in the Bronx.
And what we have seen, undeniably, is that the self-made outlier simply does not exist. Bill Gates, the Beatles, Joe Flom, and the Asian math prodigies are all beneficiaries of immense hidden advantages. They had arbitrary birth dates that put them in the right place at the right time. They had access to thousands of hours of subsidized practice when the rest of the world was locked out. And they inherited deep, powerful cultural legacies that prepared them, often invisibly, for success.
So I want you, the listener, to take a moment and reevaluate your own life. Look back at your greatest successes, your promotions, your achievements. Look at your most painful failures. How much of what you were fiercely proud of was actually aided by a tailwind you didn't even notice? A demographic sweet spot, an encouraging teacher who confused maturity with talent, a cultural attitude passed down from your grandparents that gave you practical intelligence. And conversely, how much of your frustration in life is due to a headwind of systemic design, rather than a lack of personal merit or hustle?
It requires a profound, somewhat terrifying humility to look at our achievements and admit how much luck, timing, and circumstance played a role. We want to own our success, but acknowledging the systems also offers a profound sense of hope. Because if we recognize that success is largely a product of our environment and the rules of our institutions, it means we have the power to change those rules. We can build better environments.
Exactly. I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your week. If we know definitively that a January 1st hockey cutoff artificially throws away half the athletic talent pool of an entire nation, well, what structural January 1st cutoffs are operating in secret within your own workplace, your industry, or your country right now? How many quiet geniuses like Chris Langan are we filtering out today simply because our systems are designed to reward the lucky, the older, and the privileged, rather than the genuinely capable? If we redesigned our institutions to recognize true opportunity rather than just lazy outcome metrics, how much richer, how much more innovative, and how much fairer could our world be? The X-ray machine of success might be murky, but once you see the hidden advantages, you can never unsee them. Stay curious, keep digging, and we will catch you next time.